I read this book called The Biology of Desire, Why Addiction is Not a Disease. He argues that addiction is not a disease in the sense that you are simply afflicted with it, like cancer or something of that nature, but rather that it's a learned behavior. And you're not an addict because you were just afflicted with addiction. You become an addict because there's this operant conditioning that you do something and you get the immediate positive response. And so despite the fact that there's almost always a negative side to it, if you go with just alcohol, you wake up the next morning and you have a hangover. Well, you didn't have a hangover when you had your first beer, right? And you start to chase the positive feelings and do your best to ignore or mitigate the negative outcomes.
I feel like there are people who would disagree. I have very little trouble believing that addiction is a disease for some people and not for others. What I would say is that addiction is very enslaving. And whether you are a person with a strong will or a weak will, whether you are rich or poor, whether you have a lot to live for, like you have a wife and kids and a home and a vacation home and luxury cars and everything else that, the world tells us we should be working for. Or if you have nothing, if you grew up in absolute poverty and you have less now, addiction can ravage everybody on that spectrum just as easily and enslave them all. And escaping from it is a monumental task.
As you were talking, I recalled that some of what Mark Lewis says about disease versus learned behavior is that if you have learned this behavior, then it's easier to understand how you are responsible for it. If you're able to tell yourself that you have a disease, then it does seem to me you might have a different understanding of your responsibility to work to alleviate that condition.
The number one thing I've seen lead to recovery and foreshadow a positive outcome is accountability and taking ownership. You can have a ton of bad stuff happen to you and none of it's your fault, especially if you're a little kid when it started. And then at some point you start making decisions that are negative. There's this concept of an age of accountability. At some point, bad stuff happens to you and then you start eating from it willingly. Until you own that, it's going to be really hard to break free.